Welcome back, everybody. So excited to be back here doing another one of these cEDH tier lists. Today, we are taking on 3 color commanders. Now, this is definitely going to be one of the larger categories we have going forward because when we get to 4 color, we only really have a few commanders to talk about that aren't partners. And 5 color, honestly, 4 and 5 color, I may just lump into one video. But right now, that doesn't matter at all. We're talking about the 3 color commanders in cEDH. And once again, as I just talked about the partner commander, so not the mechanic partner with, that's something completely different, but specifically cards that have partner are not going to be included in this video. So for example, we could be talking about the Esper color combination, but I'm not going to be talking about decks like Timna Malcolm. This is only for commanders that are specifically 3 colors. I'm so excited to be doing this video again. I really enjoy doing this series. Please, if you guys enjoy these tier lists for cEDH, make sure to throw it in the comments down below. Tell me how much you enjoy these. Tell me if you're really enjoying this series. I love recording these videos and I love making these tier lists and being able to talk about my favorite format of Magic the Gathering, competitive EDH. If you like this stuff, if you like this channel, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And if you're interested, go over to patreon.com/comedianmtg. We had a pretty decent restructuring of the Patreon recently where I added a tier for people to get coaching every single month as our largest supporters in the channel. There's also things like I'm going to start doing monthly live brews with everybody, and the patrons are the people who are going to be able to decide what decks we talk about, whether we're taking them in certain angles, what sort of archetypes to go through. So all of these things that you can find at patreon.com/comedianmtg. But without any further ado, let's jump into this tier list. While you're watching, make sure to leave down comments below if you agree with me, if you disagree with me. I love to have that dialogue with people down in the comments, and I tend to respond to a lot of people, and I love the conversations that come out of it. So we're going to start with Aminatou the Fate Shifter. Now, this card is super interesting, and it came out in what was like a really unpopular set at the time, but one of my favorite limited commander sets. Aminatou is really interesting, and it's a card I've kind of been obsessed with for a long time, but I've only ever played on like cockatrice, never actually sleeved it up and played it in paper. Aminatou is super cool. Obviously, those who've been watching the channel for a little bit will know that I have a lot of positive feelings towards Esper in its current configuration. I think Esper is like one of the best color combinations right now, despite a lot of people just being so deep on the Grixis copium. Like, you're still playing blue-black and you're playing white, which gives you access to Silence, to Ranger Captain of Eos, to Grand Abolisher, to Displacer Kitten and 3-mana Teferi combos, and Esper Sentinel. Like, white is like actually really, really solid right now as a support color, and I'm high on Esper in general. So you're probably going to see me rating a lot of the Esper commanders in this tier list a lot higher than some of the other color combos. That being said, Aminatou has its flaws, right? The fact that it is one of each pip, so white, blue, black, makes it a little harder to cast. Doesn't like get any reduction from things like Jeweled Lotus. It is a very fragile planeswalker. It kind of cracks Doomsday piles, but like really in a super clunky way. And its flicker ability is like the best way to play the card, right? The one sort of awkward thing that's been around with that card for a long time is that a lot of people try to play Humility in that deck, which is a little awkward because you want to be able to abuse Aminatou's flicker ability, and its flicker ability is best being used with creatures. That being said, there's some really busted cards that you can have with Aminatou. You can flicker your own Gilded Drakes to just continually keep stealing people's stuff. Some people were playing around with Mystic Sanctuary, being able to like loop a bunch of spells over and over again. You can play a fair Thassa's Oracle to bait out interaction from your opponents, and then later just be able to flicker it with Aminatou and then cast a Consultation or a Tainted Pact over it. You can do crazy stuff with Out of Time. Oh my god, Out of Time and Aminatou is absolutely insane. The ability to just be like, okay, the board's getting kind of crazy, I'm gonna play my Out of Time, things aren't gonna come back for like 15 turns, but then your opponents are like, oh no, but if I overcommit to the board again, Aminatou is just gonna be like -1, do it again. And that ability is like probably one of the main reasons to play Aminatou in the command zone, in my opinion, is its interaction with Out of Time and Gilded Drake. Like, those two interactions alone are super spicy. There's also combos with it. They're definitely not the cleanest combos. So Felidar Guardian, Altar of the Brood, and Aminatou go infinite, because what happens is you -1, flicker the Felidar Guardian, and then when Felidar comes back in, you flicker Aminatou, blah, 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 infinite flickers, then Altar of the Brood mills everybody out. There's also other ways to make that turn into damage and things like that, but that's like the most mana efficient version of that combo. I know a lot of people have played versions of that deck where they are not playing that combo, and I know there are people who have tried out that combo specifically. All that being said, Aminatou has a lot of really unique options available to it. the fragility in the command zone, the ability for it to come down and then very easily be attacked is really tough for this card. I'm, as I mentioned, very high on Esper right now, but I just think there are so many broken commanders, specifically in the Esper shard, and despite it being in some of the best colors in the format right now, I have a hard time putting it higher than B tier, just specifically because Aminatou is a little clunky in its own nature. The niche interactions I mentioned, I don't think really pull it out of the awkward position that it's in. Okay, let's talk about Animar. Animar is a classic, right? The Animar has been around for too long. That's one thing to adore about this card, is that it really has stuck around for a long time. Now, unfortunately, it's stuck around in not the most attractive way. It's not exactly like an A tier commander, but it's always a deck that I can see at the table and know it's gonna do its thing. The problem with Animar specifically is that you do need a couple of tutors to kind of get the deck to do its thing. You need your ancestral statues to get your infinite Animar things going, and then you need an outlet like your Hydroid Krasis or your Walking Ballista. There's other combos with the deck. I know there's some weird like dockside stuff you can do. And Animar is a deck that when I was like first really getting into cEDH, I used to play with a bunch of people who played it a lot in the Nexus specifically. So I played against a lot of Animar. But the trouble with Animar is when I play against it at the table, it's always one of those decks that I can like psychologically push to the side. I know like Animar is going to try and do its thing. It's going to be a little bit clunky, and because it has to be so creature heavy, it doesn't play a lot of interaction. It doesn't really have any card draw in the command zone. It does its thing really, really well. Like it does, it's the job that it wants to do. It's very good at doing that job, but it's a deck that I often can feel very comfortable letting sort of pass at the table. It's a deck that I think is decent and it can put up results in the hands of a good pilot, but the times in which Animar has been a really relevant part of the format are unfortunately very past us. So with that being said, I love Animar a good amount, but I just think it doesn't really make it out of C tier. I think the C tier is really where it stands, just one of those commanders where you're like, you'll play against it at a table, you won't be shocked that somebody's playing it. It's not bad enough that I consider it an archetype I'm suspicious of. I think it you know, it does its thing, and it is clean when it does its thing, and with a good pilot, it can put up a showing. But apart from that, I think Animar is just not going to get there most of the time. All right, let's talk about, speaking of teamer cards, teamer commanders, this is one that I have a soft spot for. So when I first started playing in Boston, I went to the same LGS that Shaper played at, and that was a great place where I learned a ton about Magic. And one of the locals there was a gentleman named Reed, who was just such a nice dude, someone I really enjoyed playing with, someone I still catch up with every once in a while, and would just main Intet the Dreamer. And when I first saw Intet, I was like, okay, I'm a little skeptical of this card, I'm not gonna lie. But when it turns cards like Mystical Tutor into a one card combo, if you connect, it kind of like, you start to figure out that it makes sense, right? Because then you get a card like Enter the Infinite, you draw your entire deck and win the game. So it's one of those cards that if you have a tutor and you attack, kind of like Yenet that we're going to talk about later, Intet kind of just like wins the game if it is allowed to do its thing. The trouble is, once again, no card advantage in the command zone. You have this weird contradiction with Intet where you kind of want to play a lot of ramp pieces to get Intet out early. You want to be able to have it connect and then be able to just win as soon as it connects. So you can't really play like a lot of collector oof things because you want to have a bunch of mana acceleration. So a lot of teamer decks I've noticed kind of have this weird contradiction where you want to be able to use the mana that red gives you. You want to be able to use Dockside. You want to be able to sometimes use your Underworld Breach combos. Not in this deck specifically, I don't think, but you want to have that potential with your list. And it's unfortunate because there's that contradiction there, and you also want to be able to stop the faster decks, right? You're never going to be as fast as a Grixis list, right? Or even an Esper list at times. So with all that being said, Intet makes a really interesting mid-range deck, but I think its lack of card advantage in the command zone just unfortunately keeps it in the fringe category, despite you know, any personal feelings I have towards the list being really cool. Kalia of the Vast. Now, Kalia is really interesting. Kalia has historically been played by like very specific pilots, and it's a deck that is super interesting because you can sort of play the Mardu thing where you're doing like this old style Turbo Naz stuff where you're not playing like your Tim Najeskas, but you're playing things like Rune Scarred Demon, or you're trying to drop a Razaketh specifically onto the battlefield, or a Villis or something like that. But then you're also kind of playing this weird ad nauseum style game plan. At least that's how I've historically seen the deck built. I think it's a little clunky, if I'm being honest, but I know there are people who have like done very well with the list in the past, and and specifically, using the fact that Kalia's ability is just kind of very strong, kind of busted. I'm actually kind of interested to see a new version of Kalia where they lean into the stacks of white a little bit more. I don't think that's really been explored, or at least if it has, I haven't heard anything about it. But I would be really curious to see people trying different versions of that. If anyone's seen a Kalia list like that, please make sure to leave that in the comments down below, because I would love to take a peek at as I mentioned, like a slower and more resilient version of Kalia that kind of uses Kalia as just like this end game finisher. It seems like really cool. It's one of those cards that is like I would love to play against a Kalia, not because I'm like, oh, I want to be able to pick apart the deck by like removing the commander, but specifically because it brings unique play patterns to the format. And anytime a deck is doing that, I'm always interested to see it see play. So Kalia is a cool card. I think because of its access to black, it's like comparable to Animar in C tier, but this is my argument for it being worse. I have seen more completely separate pilots have success with Animar than I've ever seen with Kalia. I think I've seen like 1 or 2 people ever play Kalia, nevertheless like do well with it. And I think I've actually seen like 4 or 5 people play it in the open, and I've only really ever heard of like a single player doing well with it consistently. So for that reason alone, I think Animar historically has had like more success, which is why I think it's going to be above it a little bit. Speaking of old commanders, let's talk about Karador. Karador was, I should say, the Boon Weaver deck of ages past. It was what you did in Abzan to like be the stacks deck, to play the Protean Hulk angle, to stop your opponents doing that. Unfortunately, nowadays, I hate this argument, but it's just very relevant, especially with Karador. Karador is a very clunky card, and as much as I would love to see a unique commander like this see play, it just doesn't make sense when you can play things like Timna Kodama or Timna Halana, or even like other Abzan options that we're going to talk about later. Karador is just so outclassed by things that have been printed since it that it's just it's tough to even have it in the conversation. As much as I love Karador, I think it unfortunately nowadays, it sucks, because like a lot of these might fall under something that would be closer to the long lines of like no longer, but it's gonna fall under archetypes people play that I'm suspicious of, because anyone playing Karador nowadays would make me suspicious for sure. Okay, now we're gonna talk about a card that I have a big old soft spot for, and that's the Mimeoplasm. Speaking of old commanders, right? I think the Mimeoplasm is good, and I keep talking about how I think the Mimeoplasm is good, and I keep brewing new Moxfield lists for the Mimeoplasm, but I never actually sleeve it up because there's only so many decks I can play. But I just love this idea that you have this reanimate in the command zone that also sort of like monster slices 2 cards together. Not that that's like the relevant part. The amount of times in reanimator decks where I'm just like, oh, I have this half of the reanimation combo, but I don't have this half. And the fact that with Mimeoplasm, yeah, you still play your reanimate effects, but you always have consistent access to that effect. Now, there are other things in Sultai that provide you like way more card advantage, but I think Mimeoplasm, once again, having that consistent access to that early reanimation, and I don't think 5 mana is really that unreasonable, especially with the printing of Jeweled Lotus. You have Jeweled Lotus, you have your Mana Vaults, you have your Mana Crypts. With all that being said, I would love to see a Mimeoplasm deck that someone like takes to a really solid finish. And it's like, on a personal note, I think I've bought every new copy of a Mimeoplasm that comes out, because for some reason it's such an old popular commander. They keep like printing new arts for it, and I keep buying them because I keep wanting this to be a good deck. And I think this conversation right here, and hopefully people in the comments chastising me for not building it, will finally be the kick in the butt I need to like build this deck. I just think Sultai is also in such a weird spot because green is not what it used to be in the format, and this is as a Thrasios player, right? Thrasios itself really brings green to a whole new level. But if I'm playing a reanimator deck, I'm not trying to play Collector Roof, right? And that's kind of like the weird spot that Sultai is in right now. It's the same thing with Temur, where it's like, I think you still want to be playing your artifact, so you can't play your Oof, you can't play your Null Rod, and it leaves you in this weird halfway ground. With all that being said, I think the Mimeoplasm's super cool, but I haven't seen a result with it ever from a player, so I have to like just drop it here at the like lower part of C tier and just hope that someday someone tells me that I'm full of shit and like brings it up to B or A. On the fact that it has Sultai colors alone, I think it deserves to be a low B tier, but specifically, once again, because I've never seen anyone put up a result with this commander, I think I just have to drop it to C tier, because for some reason Reanimator is like an archetype that just historically has not done great in cEDH, which is kind of wild because I know we don't have like Grizzlebrand, but we have things like Razaketh, right? And we have you know, things like Jin Gataxius that you can pull out of your graveyard, and those things somehow not being enough is kind of buck wild to me. So it's gonna be low C tier for now, but low C tier with a dream, living on a prayer that it'll be B or A tier someday, because I would love to see Mimeoplasm do well. This is a shout out everyone in the comments. If you guys have a list, drop it in the comments below. I promise I'll credit you. I want to play this card in a tournament, and I want to feel good about playing this card in a tournament. Speaking of Sultai lists that have actually put up some results, shout out to Spleenface, probably one of the best cEDH players, period. Muldrotha the Gravetide is a very powerful card. It just sort of changes the way you play the game, because it, unlike a card like Karador, which gets you like casting a single thing out of your graveyard, Muldrotha is like any permanent type, boom, these are on the battlefield. It opens up so many loops. The addition of Displacer Kitten has made a bunch of those combos like significantly easier. The ability to like have a Displacer Kitten, Muldrotha, and an LED and go, okay, I'm gonna play my LED, I'm gonna flicker Muldrotha, I'm gonna crack the LED, make 3 mana. Oh, okay. Well, this is a new Muldrotha. I haven't played anything with this Muldrotha. Play Lion's Eye Diamond out of the graveyard. And this, you can do the same thing with Lotus Petal as well. It's actually a combo that I'm, without Muldrotha, I'm playing with like Eternal Witness and some of the higher color decks in the format right now. So the fact that Muldrotha sort of just kind of stumbles into these infinite mana things super easily and provides you a ton of advantage from the graveyard. Obviously, the deck straight up scoops to like Grafdigger's Cage and Rest in Peace, right? If they don't have the removal spells that are appropriately going to answer them. But it's once again in Sultai colors. Spleenface has put up results with this deck in the past, you know, more historically so than nowadays. But with all that being said, I think Muldrotha is like a pretty solid card, and I think it's definitely the best card we've talked about yet. I'm like, it's a high B at the very least. I could even see this being like the bottom end of an A tier archetype. I really think Muldrotha has a lot of potential, but I think for now we're going to put it at the top of B. I think the top of B is where it's going to stand for now, for sure. At one point, there was a Rune the Hidden Realm list on the cEDH deck list database. That being said, it was pretty clunky. Even the person who used to run that list found it very clunky at the time. And I just wanted to mention it here to let people know that this was a deck that was played in cEDH at one point. I think the format was already moving past this card, and it has even more so just flown past it at this point. But Rune used to be a thing, kind of. So I think it's cute, but it's something I'm suspicious of now, for sure. Probably still would play it over Karador, though, because Karador is just like, when you compare it to something like Muldrotha or Tymna Halana, like I can't even see a reason to play this card. Varina, the Lich Queen, was a card I was actually pretty okay with for a while, until they printed Rafine, which we will talk about later. But Rafine is just kind of a better Varina, which sucks for Varina pretty badly, but it's just now another one of these cards that just kind of got replaced pretty aggressively. It's not a deck that I would look at the table and go, oh no, it's an Esper deck, it's not going to do anything, it's super bad. But like the fact that there is a nearly strictly better option that exists nowadays makes me like really hesitant to give this card anything higher than a C tier. That being said, as of right now, with all these cards in C tier, it's definitely the one that I would be close to respecting the most. Not to say anything bad about Animar and Kalia, because they do have concise game plans, but like just an Esper deck that has card advantage, or at least card selection in the command zone, plus the ability to generate bodies. It's not great, but it's not bad either. All right, Zur. So Zur is a card that people just love exaggerating about. You know, it was one of those cards that was like, this is one of the boogeymen of the format for years. People hated Zur. They hated playing against Zur. Zur was like, oh, how do you even stop this thing? For a while. And then Zur fell off hard when Partners got printed, right? Because you were doing Tymna Thrasios and you were doing a bunch of different stuff like that. And this is before my time, so if I misspeak historically, once again, throw that in the comments down below. But Zur is still super fucking strong. Like, I think his card is still really good. So I'm kind of touring Esper right now. I'm kind of like going through and like trying a bunch of different stuff. And of course, partner exploration is like a bunch of that right now. But like Zur having consistent access to card advantage in the command zone, like, yes, it's super obvious when it happens, right? Like you have to play Zur, and if it doesn't have haste, you have to go to combat and like do your thing, right? But with the printing of Liberator, the Urza's Battlethopter, like there's now a second Shimmer Mirror that exists. So like like that archetype got a whole new boost to it. Also, there's been a lot of work nowadays with people actually playing Heliod Ballista in Zur, because then it turns Zur attack into a 1-card combo with Ballista, because you just go grab your Heliod off of Zur. And I feel like it's just, this archetype is just not being talked about at all, and I think Zur is still super freaking strong. I think it's still a card you should respect at the table, and if you're not like removing Zur early, you're gonna lose to this card. I think it's also just because it has such a history to it, it is now just for some reason being slept on, because I don't think people want to play it anymore. But I think Zur is still very, very good, and I think if you're not respecting Zur, you're gonna lose to Zur immediately. Like, you cannot disrespect an Esper list with card advantage in the command zone and a toolbox tutor in the command zone and get away with it. I just think it's unacceptable. So yeah, Zur's an A tier for me, and like I have almost no hesitation about that decision. Okay, so Sen Triplets. I love Sen Triplets. I'm gonna be super honest about it. I adore Sen Triplets. Are the Sen Triplets fantastic? No. No, they're not fantastic, but like I just want them to be good. So I haven't seen anyone play Sen Triplets since like Ernesto from the 99 back in like 2020. So it's been a hot minute since I've seen anyone give Sen Triplets a real try. But like, I was also playing Xanathar, the blue-black version of this that costs 1 extra mana, and I had a lot of fun with it. It wasn't like an A-tier commander by any means, but I think Sen Triplets is slept on. We're gonna talk about this with Esper a lot. People tend to see Esper commanders and like turbo focus in on like, oh, I have to resolve my commander, when the Esper card pool is cracked. Like all the cards I talked about earlier in white, like all of the infinite mana stuff that you can do in those colors, the fact that you can just play like your Dauthi Voidwalkers and your Drannith Magistrates and your Esper Sentinels, and all of those things combined with the fact that you have like all of the best interaction in blue, and you have Thoracle Console and all the tutors, like this color combination is so good, and I feel like it's just like not being respected at all, which blows my freaking mind, just because red is really strong right now and has Underworld Breach. Like there are ways to play around it, and I think that there is a world in which someone could make a very respectable Sen Triplets deck. So for this, I respect Esper more than I respect Sultai, right? Which is kind of why Mimeoplasm Untested is like down here. But I would honestly rather play a Sen Triplets than a Verena any day of the week. Personally, I'd play it over Aminatou. I don't know that, you know what, this is my tier list. I'm sorry if my advice steers you wrong, but like this is my tier list, and I would play a Sen Triplets at a tournament over an Aminatou at a tournament, despite all the cool interactions we talked about earlier with Out of Time. And I think this is like, it's just a card advantage engine in the command zone that allows you to like absolutely hose your opponents, right? Like, and the fact that it like grand abolishers one player, also it like doesn't hurt at all. I think the card's like kind of solid, and I think it's really weird that it just doesn't see play at all. All right, Abaddon the Despoiler. Abaddon, when it first came out, I was kind of a narc about, and I was just like, why aren't you gonna play Yidris? Abaddon seems like bad Yidris. And I think I was wrong about that. I'm like pretty confident in saying that that was a hasty opinion, we'll say. But I think Abaddon is actually just like good enough on its own. The fact that once again, like you can crack Jeweled Lotus for 3 of the mana is like extremely relevant for casting this card. The fact that your Soul Rings and your Mana Crypts actually help you cast this card, unlike Yidris, which is something you want from this Stormier list, right? You lose cards like Song of Creation and Manamorphose and your Veil of Summers if you play those, or like other green cards, but green has never been like the best color in Yidris by any means. And with that being said, I think Abaddon's actually pretty solid. I think it's been pretty underexplored. It's still new, right? In the grand scope of things. Think about half the commanders I've talked about. Some of these have been around for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, right? So in the grand scope of things, Abaddon is just like a blink of an eye and it's there, right? And the next 3 commanders are from Warhammer, so like we'll be the same mentality. But with that being said, I think Abaddon's very solid. I think Grixis is obviously one of the best color combinations right now. Like it's not hard to say. Many people would argue it is the best color combination right now as far as 3 color pairings. So with that in mind, I think Abaddon deserves to be at the bottom of A tier. It's a little, as I mentioned, like the fact that you need your commander, you need it to connect to do the thing, and you have to go off with Manual Storm is definitely like a problem, right? Like there are definitely ways to disrupt it and that combo and those like play patterns, but it's also just like a solid way of like guaranteeing that you can pop off pretty early, and it's like the win conditions in the command zone, right? So I think it's not as good as Zur, but I have a hard time leaving any Grixis list out of A tier right now, which God, I hate saying, but I think Abaddon deserves a place here for sure. All right, let's talk about Magus, Lucea, Kane. This card is super interesting. Another one of these things we're talking about where It is a Warhammer card. It is super underexplored because it's brand spanking new, but it's really cool. The thing I noticed when I was looking into this list is like, one, you rely on Magus to sort of just make your deck good, right? Like, it's not that your deck is unplayable without Magus. It's just the fact that like turning your tutors into double tutors is kind of the gimmick. And if you can't play your commander and then untap with it without it eating removal or something like that, makes it a little tougher. It starts as a 1/1 and then gives itself a counter, but it is fragile. Like, that is a 4 mana 1/1 that turns into a 4 mana 2/2. So hoping you untap with it is definitely a thing. I think you'll definitely get wins if you play this deck, just because it's not the scariest thing in the entire world and people like don't have to aggressively respect you as much. So it's really cool in that sense, right? Like, the fact that you untap with that and then you put 5 mana into it and you get both halves of a Kiki combo is like, hooray, you win the game, right? Like, it's that simple to actually do the thing, right? If you finale for 5, right? So you need to pay green, green, and 3, which is 5 mana, because Magus taps for 2 mana. That seems very reasonable to me, to have this just like, oh, tap for a finale, 5 mana, win the game. The other part that's kind of like weird about this deck is that when you stop looking at Kiki combos, the creature combos get a lot worse. That all being said, I think Magus is totally fine. I think it's a unique option that exists in the format right now. I think it's probably like good enough to be in the higher C or lower B tiers. I think the 3-color tier list is a little harder because I think the onus of a 3-color deck is like, these decks are all super freaking solid. Like, these are all respectable decks at the table. Even the ones that I'm suspicious of, I still would know that these decks are scary, right? So Magus, I think it's like top of C tier right now. And once again, recognizing that Varina, as I said, is not a bad deck. It's just there's a nearly strictly better version of it that exists, right? I just want to keep reminding people of that so they're not looking at Varina past tense. But I like Magus at the top of C tier right now, maybe even good enough to be bad B tier. Now, Warhammer cards that have seen play already and have already put up impressive performances, making the top 16 of the second Mox Masters, a deck that I played against in that top 16. I've seen Marneus a couple times, like one at a local store, and then ironically, the tournament I won with Tivit, I was going to sleeve up Marneus for that tournament, but I just decided that because I didn't have a few of the cards, I didn't want to make the proxies for that. So I sleeved up Tivit instead, because it was like a 51%, 49% decision. And obviously now Tivit is a pet deck of mine and a deck that I have my first tournament win with. But Marneus Calgar is very, very solid. And it's a deck I respect the heck out of. It has infinite mana outlets. It has its Stasis Oracle lines. It's an Esper, like I've been talking about. Just so much respect for the Esper color combination right now. It's broken with Smothering Tithe. Like, that interaction is absolutely cracked because each individual treasure is a trigger, right? So each time you make a treasure with Smothering Tithe, so some draws 3 cards, they've cast a Brainstorm into your Smothering Tithe, you make 3 mana and then draw 3 cards with Marneus. So the card's very, very good at what it does. The problem is that the card advantage engine in the deck relies very heavily on Marneus, and Smothering Tithe and maybe like Black Market Connections are like some of the good token enablers, but you're also kind of forced to play some kind of mediocre ones like Monastery Mentor or like Bitter Blossom, that are cards that are like really cool in the deck but not historically cEDH staples. So you've definitely got to play your like cute synergy cards to make the deck work. But that being said, it's an Esper. You get to play some of the best cards in the format, and it's hard for me to argue that this is not another A tier commander. I almost would rather play Marneus than Abaddon in a tournament. So I think that's where I'm going to leave it for now. I think this conversation is super flexible. I just think the history of Zur and being the tyrant that it once was and has the potential to now be still keeps it above it. But like, this is a very active conversation between these 3 decks right now. All right, Prosh, another one of our outdated decks. Unfortunately, I think Prosh is super cool. I think there's just so many cool combos that can happen with Prosh. I would not be surprised to see someone top 16 a tournament with a Prosh deck because they're like, yeah, the deck does the thing and it does it really efficiently. And you're like, congratulations, you did it. All that being said, as much as I think Prosh is super cool, I do think that, you know, it's definitely a deck that has had time pass it by. So for right now, it's tough between heavy fringe and like C tier, right? Because I think it's actually good, and like, it's a fringe list that is good enough to make C tier, but when you compare it to things like Korvold, it's a little tough. I would love to see someone do well with Prosh, seriously, but I think it has to be like the best fringe deck Yeah, for right now at least. All right, Minsc, Beloved Ranger. This is a deck that is good, and I feel like it doesn't get talked about as much as it deserves. It is like one of the most consistent top 16 decks we have right now. It is up there with your Teamer Malcolms and your Roccos and like decks like that are just like, oh, there's been another top 16. Oh, Minsc and the Beloved Ranger is like there again. I was talking about this with someone or a couple of people in my Discord earlier today, where they're like, I think it has access to the most one card wins of any deck, just because you play a Rector, you zero it with Minsc, and you're doing your combo, right? That's it. That's all you need. You need your commander and one other card. And there's two Rectors that do that. There's Protean Hulk itself. You can use your Natural Order to sack a dork. You can use your Pattern of Rebirth, right? There are all these options that exist, and the fact that like Minsc also gives you Boo, which is a card you can put your Pattern of Rebirth onto. Now, the fact that it's a sorcery speed restriction is definitely a factor, but the fact that there's not only like this archetype that exists, this like very solid Naya Turbo Hulk strategy that gets around a lot of the anti-turbo stuff in the format and beats up on decks like Winota and stuff like that. Like, it is a very solid deck that does these things, but you can also build a Staxier version of it to also attack those decks. You can play your Collector Roofs, you can play your Rule of Laws, because you need to resolve a single freaking spell to win the game. It is very, very solid at just doing the thing. So I have a lot of respect for this deck, and it's going to be one of our highest non-black decks in the format right now. Is this deck? It just does the thing so well. It has a hard time like recovering if you really blow out your resources, but like once again, then the one card combos are just still on the table. You can still top deck stupid well, and you have green, which is just like, oh, I get a creature. Oh, I get a creature. There's 18,000 ways to just get a creature and win the game. So yeah, a lot of respect for this deck, really, genuinely. This is a Transformer card. I hate that this is a thing, but we got to talk about Megatron. Megatron is a cEDH viable commander. Cringe. Megatron's a cEDH viable commander. It grand abolishers your turn after combat, and then you can like hit your opponent's connect, sack a thing, get a bunch of mana, and then have this like uninteractable second half of your turn where you can use the colorless mana you just sacrificed from an artifact to then cast your ad nauseum. It is for some reason a real deck that you have to respect. So that being said, the other Mardu options that exist right now are probably better. And once again, no card advantage in the command zone either, right? Which is pretty huge when you compare it to Timna Jeska or Timna Rograk. So with all of those things being said, I don't know. I haven't seen it played yet. Brothers War just happened, right? So it is hard to say with confidence if this is going to be a real deck or if people are even going to try it. But yeah, it's a card. We're going to put it in like lower B tier because Mardu is really solid right now. Having a Grand Abolisher in the command zone is not bad. Jaleva's still good. I still think this deck is solid. It's like super comparable to Evelyn. They're very similar commanders, and it provides card advantage. It's like a weird dockside outlet too, where you can exile your opponent's decks and then pass a turn. It's in Grixis, still really good colors. There are a lot of better Grixis options that exist, but I sort of gun to my head. I don't think I can say that this is a deck that doesn't deserve to at least be in high B tier, low A tier, because it's card advantage in Grixis. It also has like the incidental value of just being able to like disrupt your opponent's combos sometimes if you get lucky and then like exile the top 10 cards. So if you've cast Jaleva twice, right? I've seen this card played where it just like it exiles a couple win cons your opponents have, and then they're like, oh shit, what do we even do now, right? It is difficult to place it right now because I want to say I don't know that it cracks into A tier because it's definitely like not the cleanest card advantage engine, and I don't think it's better than Muldrotha, maybe. I don't know, the Grixis color pie is so good right now, and people keep feeding into it to make it better. Yeah, I think it's just less clunky than Muldrotha too. Damn. Yeah, I think it's just bottom of A tier. I don't think it's going to get past like the low parts of A tier, but it's still super solid. Marath, thanks to Kai, Fervent Alchemist, I have a lot more respect for this deck than I ever did historically. That all being said, it's an infinite mana outlet in the command zone, and also it's creature removal if you need it, or extra bodies if you need it. So for me personally, right, as someone who maintains the Dawnwaker Thrasios primer, it's hard for me to ever want to play this card over something like Dawnwaker, but it is a super solid infinite mana deck. It will definitely win you surprise points. Maybe not now that I'm saying that out loud in this video, but like I think it's a deck that can steal wins pretty easily. I kind of watched Kai do that a bunch during the MLC this year, just like, oh, infinite mana Marath, ha 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 ha. It has access to white too, so you can play your Grand Abolishers and your Ranger Captains, and And sometimes just like Naya stacks with infinite mana combos gets you there. It's a little awkward because obviously Dockside is your best combos and you don't want to be shutting off artifacts. Once again, the contradiction that we're going to talk about a ton today. You're in green, but you don't want to play your Null Rods, your Sonies, your Collector Roofs. But Marath is just solid at what it does, and I think it deserves to be like bottom of B tier maybe. Like it just does its thing really really well. Okay, this next one's gonna be easy to talk about. Edgar Markov. People were playing it as like a weird Razaketh ad nauseum commander for a little bit. It's cute, right? Because you play your vampires and then get a bunch of dorks for Razaketh, but like Mardu is capable of so much better than that in the command zone, and I think like it being the scourge of casual kind of is what made it even like slightly a thing at one point. But it is definitely an archetype I'm super suspicious of. Anala. This is a deck I respect the ever-living crap out of. Also a deck that I tend to play decks that are really good against it. So it's really hard for me to evaluate this card perfectly fairly. Like when Noda just sort of absolutely clowns on Anala, because when Anala doesn't have like that advantage in the command zone. I've also gotten punked by Anala way too many times than I'm comfortable admitting. I think this deck is actually insane. Because of its early game potential is one of the best in the entire format. Like there are hands where it is faster or as fast as Rog Silas, just because of being able to be like land Chromox Dark Ritual Spellseeker, win the game, or Gemstone Caverns, same thing, or Mox Diamond, right? Like these are real things I've seen happen live to me. There's a video playing the power of me losing to a turn 1 with Cam from the Lab Maniacs being in second seat. They play a Gemstone Cavern, they play a land Dark Ritual Spellseeker. Like this has happened to me IRL. So Inala just has this like insane potential, combined with the fact that a competent pilot can navigate the game in a way to kind of just steal the win out of nowhere. There's now lines in the deck that are completely able to play around rule of laws too, which is like for a Grixis deck that relies on usually like 30 spells being cast, to find out that then later they have these options to completely circumvent that is kind of crazy. And also just the icing on the cake that is this card, like I'm so bad at this deck. Or maybe I don't know how to mulligan with it correctly, or every time I play this deck I always feel like I'm down to 5 cards and I never see these nut hands that everyone else seems to have with this deck, and then I just don't do anything because there's no card draw on the entire list. You know, I respect really good Anala pilots a lot because clearly they are touched by some sort of deity to have these god hands, right? But for me, every time I go to play this deck, I'm like, okay, I'm mulligan to 4. I didn't see anything good. I have a turn 2 Wish Claw after playing a land. Like that's how I always feel like I'm playing against this deck. Or like, I got hit with a mental misstep. I'm done. But every time I see it played against me, the deck's insane. So like I have no idea how to rank this list. With all that being said, I think it's one of the best decks in the format right now, and one of the best non-partner decks in the format, like pretty hands down. But is it good enough to be S tier? I don't know. I think it's right now it's the top of A tier, and I have almost no hesitation saying that. Zur maybe puts up a fight, but like I don't know. That's tough. It's a tough fight. Zur's card advantage and late game potential is like way, 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 way better. But Inala is just, it's so consistent when I see it played against me once again. It is solid. It's a super solid card and a super solid deck, and I respect the hell out of it. And I'm putting it up here in A tier because despite it having a very deep floor, it also just has this exponential ceiling, and I just keep seeing it do crazy stuff. It's also one of those decks that like you sometimes you're in those pods where like no one's playing blue, and it just punishes those pods so badly. Like it dunks on those pods so hard. Marisil's cute. I know there was like a Brewer's Corner version of the deck recently that was playing like Asmodeus combos. The fact that like you can just play 3 black and draw 7 cards is like it's fun. Like you build your own Grizzlebrand kind of, and that's about it. I think Marisil is kind of fun. It's in Grixis, could be a lot worse, but you don't really want to play your Adnaz, your Grixis options, but you also want to be able to like entomb a bunch of like really powerful stuff, like you can turn your Marisil into a Razaketh and things like that. So I think there's still a good amount of work to be done with the card. I don't think it's been solved by any degree, but I think it's like it's somewhere in this like weird C tier category, probably like top of C tier, with the potential of being like even a mid B tier if built, you know, if people like figure out the rhythm of that deck. Okay, let's talk about Estrid. Estrid's cool. I like Estrid. Estrid is maybe one of the best stasis commanders that exist. We have like Yorn, we have Estrid, we have Derevi, but Estrid like does the thing. It's pretty cute. It was like one of the first cEDH decks I ever played against in the store, and I like really wanted it to be a good deck for a really long time. I think it's the best heavy fringe deck we have right now, but it's fun and it's cool, and like I love a good stasis combo, which should tell you way too much about me as a person, but it's a deck that I like a lot, so I'm gonna put it there. Lord Windgrace. People were trying to make Lord Windgrace like obliterate Yockle Hops style decks that like you blew up all this stuff and then you like got lands back and then you win with a big thing. So like I remember like way like a couple years ago, one of the Playing with Power guys was playing a version, and like they did the obliterate thing, and then they played like an Inferno Titan, and that was cool, and it happened. It's pretty suspicious. I'm like, it's the best of this list so far because of the colors it has access to, and like it has a concise game plan, but it's a pretty sus archetype. Tuvasa. So Tuvasa top 16 a tournament like right when I first started cEDH, and I think is a underexplored commander because I think just like playing stacks Enchantress with access to blue and the ability to, you know, just draw a card every turn, you play your Rule of Laws and just have your Tuvasa out there like continually maintaining card advantage and playing stacks pieces, and you get to play your Stony Silences, your Collector Roofs. I think it's cool, and I think it's like a solid card, and I think it actually is very, very underexplored. So this is my call out to people. If anyone's seen a cool Tuvasa list recently, like please let me know. And if anyone hasn't, you know, maybe guys, maybe some of you folks out there take a look. I don't know. But we'll put it at the top of Fringe because it's been so unproven, right? But like I don't know, it could be cool. All right, Yennet. So Yennet's a card I've been tinkering around a lot with recently, and this will be a big shout out to Charles Ivaldi, the mono white guy, who is kind of going on his I'm not playing mono white anymore arc, which is really fun, and I love brewing with Charles, and this has been a very fun experience. There are things happening, and I don't want to spoil anything before we're ready to like publish stuff because it's going to look ridiculous before we publish it. But Charles had some kind of crazy ideas, and there's a fun Yennet deck that I'm trying to build with those ideas. That all being said, reining it back into my evaluation of the card in its current form, it's an Esper deck. We've talked about this before. I think Esper cards are so broken right now. They're very strong. You can play your stacks pieces and your mid-range engines. Yennet's not a great card advantage piece in the command zone, and it's a strategy that really, really gets affected by Drannith Magistrate. So with all that being said, it's a solid Esper deck, and I think it's better than something like Varina. I would argue it's better than Aminatou, and I would argue that it has a more cohesive game plan than something like a Sen Triplet. It definitely has that, like, it relies on the commander gimmick thing a little bit, but there's some really busted stuff you can do in that light, and that's kind of how I see Muldrotha too, right? Like, there's definitely heavy on the commander gimmick, so I think, like, these two being the top of B tier, being these solid options that are also, like, gimmicky, it's totally fine. Speaking of gimmicky commander decks, Elsha. Elsha is constantly underrated because I think a lot of new players really like Elsha. Elsha's a really fun deck to play. It like lets you do some really cool stuff. Like you can Underworld Breach at instant speed over the top of people. Ever since Breach is printed, the deck has gotten faster and faster, which some people argue is not the direction to actually take Elsha in, and I've argued that it should be played more as a mid-range deck historically. So with all that being said, I think Elsha is super solid. I think it's probably the best Jeskai deck, maybe with another one we're about to talk about being close-ish, but Elsha is just like a really solid deck. It gets hit heavily by Grafdigger's Cage and Drannith Magistrate, which happen to be extremely good in the format right now. Also, Elsha is a deck where you can really play like your Pyroclasm effect and get paid off in them really well because you're playing like no creatures at all. So I'm a big Elsha fan. The win conditions are a little sloppy. That's just kind of part of the deck, but it's also the first deck I ever had a tournament result with, and it was just like one of those early command fests where it was like those 3-round tournaments, but I did really, really well with Elsha, and I made the top pods with that way back in the day. But Elsha is just a solid deck. I think it's another like solid B tier commander. I think it's better than freaking Megatron. I think it's better than Aminatou, probably better than Sen Triplets, maybe. It's like here. It's a very solid option. I think it gets constantly overlooked and not always built in the most optimal way, but I love Elsha. I think it's very strong. I like the card a lot. I like the deck a lot. I think it brings great things to the format. I have nothing but good stuff to say about this commander. All right, P&H, Paco and Halden. So this is a tough one for me. Because I'm super biased. I currently run one of the primers listeners online, my co-host of this podcast back in the day, my old cEDH cast, Brayden was the person who like made Paco and Halden a thing in the first place. It's also the deck that won me the MLC, right? That's the deck I brought to the finals match because it had just been consistently winning games in that league so often. So I have a lot of positive affection for Paco and Halden. I've also took it to the first tier 1 con, which was a bad choice on my part, but it was a deck I wanted to play at the time, and I brought it there, and it just got like stomped hard because of the fact that it was a bunch of turbo metas and people were overreacting to how big Paco was getting because they were like, don't hit me, I play Adnaz, and it was a whole thing. I probably was not politicking appropriately for that tournament, but it was also really tough given the way the tournament was going. But Paco and Halden is a deck that I really enjoy it. I think it's very solid. If you're in like one of those metas where you're like, everyone I know in my local meta plays mid-range decks, you bring a Paco and Halden and you're just gonna start stomping on people because it is the mid-range killer. Like, it is so good in those metas. I have continued success with it. The toughest card for the deck is Drannith Magistrate, hands down. It is very, very hard for that deck to win with the Drannith because even if you have your commanders out, you can't cast things off of Halden. But when you accrue a ton of card advantage with this deck, it gets pretty insane. It's tough to play well because, you know, every micro decision you make will just launch you miles and miles ahead of your opponents. It's one of those decks that really rewards good piloting skills. I like the deck a lot. I think it has a lot of potential, and I would love to see someone put up another result with it. I'm always like 1 second away from sleeving it up for a tournament. It's also a deck that I do not unsleeve. Like, it has a permanent place in my deck boxes. Big fan of Paco and Halden in general. I think it definitely deserves to be, because of its actual deep runs that it made during a period of time historically, I think it deserves to be up here in like this rank. I think maybe around the Elsha, Yennet, Muldrotha category. I think this is like a really solid top of B tier. I don't think these crack into A, but I think Paco and Halden's really, really strong, and I think it's constantly overlooked. All right, everybody. So much like the last tier list we did on this channel, I found that this video was taking a good amount of time. I still have about another hour of cards to talk about, and I figured it would make a lot more sense to break this video into 2 separate parts. So this is the conclusion of part 1 of the cEDH 3-color tier list. I want to thank you all for joining me for this episode. Most likely next week we're going to have a breakdown of the top 4 of Silicon Dynasty, but the week after that, look forward to part 2 of this tier list on this channel. Now remember, if you like videos like this, make sure to hit like and subscribe. It helps out the channel a ton. And if you leave comments down below talking about the cards you agree with, you disagree with, I'd love to get the dialogues going with those things. That's one of my favorite part about doing these tier lists, is like getting a wide variety of opinions from people and learning what people are seeing out in the open meta. So thank you all for watching. It's super appreciated. We have a bunch of different stuff to announce. I'm also now an affiliate of Dragonshield, so there will be a link down below. Now, Dragonshield sleeves are the sleeves that I use for literally all of my decks. I have the same matte black sleeves for literally all of my cards with Dragonshield inner sleeves on the inside, and it's literally the same for my entire cEDH collection. So when I contacted them just to talk about like working together, and as soon as I saw that they were able to work with me, I jumped onto that decision. So as I mentioned, there'll be an affiliate link down in the description below, and if you use my code, it helps out the channel a little bit, and they're literally the only sleeves I use for my cards, so it feels like a pretty safe endorsement to say I'm happy to be an affiliate of Dragonshield. In addition, as I mentioned on the last video, I have started cEDH coaching, so if that is something you are interested in, you can feel free to hit me up on Discord, on Twitter. The links of those will be down in the description below, and you can also feel free to hit me up at my email at comedianmtg@gmail.com. If you have any interest in cEDH coaching sessions, curious about how much the rate is, things like that, feel free to hit me up on there. Thank you so much for joining me for part 1 of this cEDH 3-color tier list, and I'll catch y'all in the next one. Have an awesome week. Peace.
I can feel the blood creeping up from the heathens. Got will, got fight, got pride, got reason. If they wanna go eat, then you know I'm gonna feed them. If you're coming for me, hope you're ready for a demon. I got eyes in the back of my head, I'm seeing. Take me for granted and you know I'm leaving. I'ma take what's mine with the webs I'm weaving. I could take this crowd from seeing to believing.